and we're rapidly coming to that point where I want to
Yeah,
fuse the two bits of this conversation so far. So why don't
yeah,
we, as you've introduced it, really? Um, so yeah, I mean, it's very nice of you to share with us some of your personal story, but it's that personal story combined, I guess, with a slight sidestep from religious study.
mm,
But being an academic, that's enabled you to get into doing some research, reading, and writing about
yeah,
this business of spirituality within recovery, and what is or isn't a higher power, and do people align themselves with God in mutual aid and all that sort of stuff.
mm,
So
mm.
we'd love it if you just tell us a little bit more about that stuff, I think. Yes.
Yeah,
And this
sure.
particular focus on spirituality and recovery, really. Yes. So why didn't you start?
Yeah,
You were mentioning a higher power, so why don't we go from there,
yeah,
really? Yes, because
yeah.
that's intrinsic to some of the language and the tenets of mutual aid, isn't it? For example, yes.
Yeah, so yeah, it's kind of central to 12-step mutual aid organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, all the other anonymous fellowships. There are dozens and dozens of them. Um, and those groups that use the 12 steps, they start with this concept of powerlessness. Um, and argue that if the experience of the substance use or the behavior is beyond your willpower, um, then there has to be some other power that is going to bring about the behavior change, the abstinence or whatever. So, you know, for lots of people, of course, it might be that they can exert their willpower and they do successfully. And maybe some people need support to exert their willpower. Um, well, if those people can do that successfully and they're comfortable with that, then that's, that's brilliant. And
Yeah, yeah.
there's no need for this, very different kind of model um,
Mm.
of understanding it. But those,
And it's
Alcoholics
intrinsic to
Anonymous,
the early steps, isn't it? It's
yeah,
of those of that 12-step model. Yes.
yeah. So the first step is the acknowledgement of powerlessness,
Mm.
and the second step is coming to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. But I mean, we need to remember that these steps were written in the 1930s in America by white Christian men, um, who came from quite a pious
Mm-hmm.
Protestant background. I mean, one of them in particular came from a very pious background, um, and for them, that experience of a higher power was, indisputably God, the God of the Bible or the God of the Christian church or whatever. Um, but very early on in the development of Alcoholics Anonymous, which was the first of the 12-step fellowships, there was a kind of um, room was made for people to interpret that concept of higher power however they wanted to and however made sense for them. So there were
Beyond the white Christian,
atheists.
essentially beyond the white Christian God, if they needed to. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's, for me as a kind of historian of spirituality and an ethnographer, I'm really interested in how that language has changed over the 80 years that the fellowships have been around. And then, so you can see kind of shifts. There's kind of published books, book called Came to Believe that was written in the 60s, published in the 70s, and you can see the language shift in that. But then there's, another significant language shift to the present day. And if you ask contemporary members of 12-step fellowships, what do they mean by this concept of higher power? You get a massive diversity of interpretations. And
And,
I think
and
crucially that the thing that people don't realize or often um, you know, that there's this kind of characterization of 12-step fellowships as incredibly religious, but in
Well, I was about to
fact,
say that. So, despite that transformation that's gone on within the fellowship, you very often, as I do in all the different worlds that I occupy, you hear people get to a rapid rejection without having tried
yeah, yeah,
fellowships because they just say, "Well, I'm not going to do that God stuff," like
yeah,
or
yeah, yeah.
and that's how it's often paraphrased, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and I understand why, because the literature of the fellowships is still that 1930s
Oh,
literature, and you
okay.
go into a meeting and there's these, you know, very religious looking scrolls on the wall, and the word God is there. You know, it is very kind of upfront in the kind of formal language of
Yes.
the fellowships. So I can see why it is incredibly off-putting to people. But then as you listen to the voices of actual members, you hear the really creative ways that they interpret and reinterpret that language in a way to make sense of it for themselves. So a really common um, kind of translation of that word God is group of drunks. So that, you know, you could say that is a higher power, God, group of drunks. That's a higher power. These people in this meeting who used to drink to, you know, really destructive levels are now abstinent. That's a power, that's a force that you know a newcomer can tap into. It's the power of example, the power of community, power of friendship, you know, people on a shared endeavor. You know, there's power in that. So you don't have to romanticize it or theologize it
Mm.
in any way, and very often people don't. So, you know, in my research, I found that
I was
only
about to say
20.
you've explored this not beyond the personal now into the
Oh
professional, haven't
yeah,
you? Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
So only 25% of my participants describe themselves as religious. And that's, you know, how you measure religiosity in the general public is obviously complex, but I
Yeah,
mean
yeah.
that's still much less than the current census would say. So in a way you could say the fellowships were less religious than the general
But at another
public.
level,
So
they've all accepted a notion of higher power because they've successfully worked through some of those steps then. Yes.
yeah, so yeah, I mean people who stick around in the fellowships do tend to, not all of them, but there's a tendency to accept the concept of higher power, but they will often interpret it in very secular ways.
Hmm.
So it's just the power of friendship, it's the power of the group, it's the power of having a daily program. You know, lots of ideas that you would find like in smart recovery that would present itself as you know, rational and
Mm.
scientific. You know, those very same mechanisms are working in this apparently religious or
Yeah, yeah.
spiritual
And
context.